Hello, my name is Nick. I'm the owner and operator of Filament Farm. This is the live stream and recording of a series of videos about how to assess 3D models and support 3D models, all for resin 3D printing. This is not going to touch on filament 3D printing or some of the other intricacies with resin printing at the moment. This live stream is to create a series of videos on supporting 3D models for resin printing. So to begin with, I'm going to be using a lychee slicer. There are a number of slicers available. This is the one that I prefer to use, and I'm hoping that a lot of the tips and tricks that I present here are usable with different slicing programs. A lot of the tips and tricks and the way we go about it and the process you can be able to use in just about any slicer. That being said, I will be using some tools to help visualize some things that are unique to the paid version of Lychee Slicer. You do not need those features to do any of this work necessarily, but it does help guide the process along a little. So what we're going to be focusing on today is assessing 3D models and then supporting 3D models. What I mean by assessing is taking a look at the model and determining how you want to orient it so that your support placement is both efficient and out of the way. We want to preserve as many details as possible on a 3D model, and we want to hide any blemishes that the supports create on unseen surfaces. So what I typically do to begin this process is import my model. Today's model is a Goblin Scout that has been provided by Claymore Miniatures. I do some support work for them, and we will be supporting one of their models today. Links to their store and their Patreon will be in the description of this video. So first off, we bring in both the model itself and the base. I've got slightly different tacks I take for both of these, but the overarching goal is the same. We want to get as much detail out as possible while minimizing surface blemishes. So let's start right now with just the Goblin. We'll set the base off to the side. This particular Goblin, I like to get both the base and the model out. You kind of get an idea of how the model sits on the base. So for this particular model, we can see that it's going to be crouched up on this branch here. So a lot of the front face is going to be open and visible. The front of this crossbow is going to be a kind of a feature piece as well. So we know that we'll have connections to the base on the feet, and some of these underside portions are not going to be visible. We also know that this back side of the crossbow is facing away from where or how you'll generally be displaying this mini, so that is another good area for supports. We want to keep all aspects of the 3D printing in mind as we're doing our supports. It helps to think about how somebody would display this model on a shelf once it's printed. It also helps to think about all the steps it takes to get there as well. We're kind of in the beginning with the supports. You got to think about how a model prints, and then also how easy it is to take the supports off a model. I go through an extra step after supporting everything to adjust my supports to make sure the supports print correctly and are easy to remove as well. This is it's a little bit above and beyond for somebody just printing stuff for home use. Since I know other customers are going to be using and printing these models, I like to make that experience as easy for them as well. We also want to remember that a successful print is the ultimate goal here. And we will minimize supports when necessary, but a successful print is going to waste far less resin in supports than a failed print will. So we go kind of pretty aggressive with supports just to make sure we get a good model in the end, because if we have half a print or a failed print, we're going to waste far more resin than we would with a few extra supports here or there. So that's kind of the tact we're going to take. But for now, we know that this guy is going to set up on this branch, and we'll kind of adjust him accordingly. So for now, I'm going to set the base off to the side, and we will focus on this goblin here. So this is how it will sit on its base. How a model sits on its base is not necessarily how you want to print it. We want to preserve features as much as possible, primarily features on this front-facing side. And then we want to create ideal support placements for ourselves as we go through this process. So looking at this goblin, we can see we're in a pretty good place as it sits. We've got a lot of access to the underside of the model, and we have a lot of options for placing heavier supports and our more strong connections to the build plate. As we are thinking about the printing process, this kind of gridded base here is going to be our build plate, and it's a little backwards to think about, but this build plate is then going to be hanging upside down, and this model is going to print from the build plate up. So we need to support specific features. This particular model is going to be interesting because we're going to have a bunch of these little leaves to support on the back as well. So we've got a couple different texts to take here. I'm going to use my rotate tool and just kind of point this guy a little more up. Typically facial features and chins and ears and noses and sometimes teeth are very primary features that we want to capture on the front of a face. And generally we want to try to point these features facing up so we don't need to support them at all. This particular model, that also creates a little bit more access on the back here for us to support each one of these leaves. So looking at this guy, another tool I use that's part of the pro version of Lychee is something called layer thickness preview. So according to my settings for my machines, this is going to generate a preview of each individual layer that the printer is going to create. What we're looking for are all of these very beginning layers. We call these islands. These islands are where that particular portion of the model are going to start printing, and those are where we need to start supporting first off. So I like to turn this view on while I am orienting the model, because it really gives me a hint as to where this model is going to start printing on all the individual features. The feet, the individual toes here each have a starting spot, the fingernails, the fingers. It really gives us a really good idea of where we're going to need to eventually begin to place supports. It also helps me determine how I'm going to orient this model. We can see here, I mentioned that facial features tend to be hard and an area we really want to make sure we don't have any blemishes on. So I'm looking at this view here, and I see we've got a little bit of island on the chin here. We can continue to move this model back, and we see that that island begins to disappear. That means that I'm not going to need to support this portion of the face at all. Unfortunately, that means some of these pieces on his hat here are now free floating, and we're going to need to support them, and they might be a little bit harder to get to. But if we think again back to how this model is going to be displayed, the bottom portions of these of his little hat here are going to be facing down, so we're kind of okay with any blemishes that might result. Again, this gives us a lot of access to the back, to each one of these leaves. We see tip of each one of these leaves is a island and something we're going to need to support. So we're looking pretty good with that there. Unfortunately, tilting it this far back results in a lot of supports being placed on the back and another portion of the model that's going to be quite visible. Granted, we're usually looking at these minis from the front, but if we think about them on a tabletop or in the middle of a map while we're playing, the back is still fairly visible as well. So I'm going to, at the sacrifice of needing to support this chin a little bit, I might bring this forward a little bit more to keep some of the heavier and more sturdy supports that we're going to place to the underside of the model and a side that we're not going to see a whole lot of. As far as left to right, I don't need any of that right now. Everything's looking pretty centered. We're going to have good access to the back to support this whole crossbow. I think this is going to be a good place to start. We will set Goblin aside for now and take a look at our base. Bases are unique. On most bases, there's a very good face to support and to heavily support, obviously that being the bottom of the base. And it's really easy, and with some of the tools inside of Lychee, that makes that very simple. So what we're going to mainly focus on is anything on top of the base. And again, we can kind of see here that some of this area is free floating, and we're going to have a lot of supports or little islands needed underneath this particular branch. Something we can do is we see it kind of curves up and starts to build on itself. I'm going to start this by tilting, actually, I'm going to start by spinning this around. Wherever we can, we want the model to build upon itself. So if the model starts printing and has solid connections and continues to build from there, the model supporting itself, quote unquote, is always going to be preferable. So with this kind of swooping branch, we can rotate it so it starts attached to the model and begins to build up, and then only builds upon itself as it goes. We might consider supporting this a little bit more just to increase the likelihood that it's going to print successfully, but at least in this orientation, it's always building upon itself and doesn't technically need any supports. We can also look and see these arrows are one by one layers building upon each other all the way up, so they don't technically need supports. These little ferns or bushes here, just because they have a whole lot of leaves, are going to need a lot of supporting anyway, but there wasn't going to be a way to really mitigate that a whole lot with this particular base. So by tilting this up, it gets us a real clean starting point. It leaves the back open for the majority of the heavy supports, and then all we need to worry about is supporting some of the finer details on these ferns. For the scope of this video, we're not going to move on to supporting this base. We are just going to focus on the goblin. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that, bring this guy front and center, and we'll move to supporting. We've got him oriented correctly. Right now, he is also touching the build plate, so we need to create a little bit of space below him to make sure we get our support connections in. Really where we want to start, and the tack that I usually take with supporting these minis, is starting from the ground up, really. So a lot of the times in more humanoid models, that's going to be beginning with the feet. Usually these figures are standing up on their own 2 feet, so the feet are generally pretty solid connection points to the base and a really good place to put your heavier support connections to kind of hide those blemishes, because once they get glued to a base, nobody's going to ever see them. With this particular model, we know that the feet are being connected to that branch on the base, so we can go ahead and put some heavier supports here. And what I typically do when I'm supporting models, my methodology is to kind of start with the feet, do each leg all the way up, any bits of armor or anything hanging off the legs, and move all the way up into the torso. Complete the torso and the main part of the body. I'll move on to the face and then the back, and then I'll do any arms or extremities that are coming off. This guy is pretty compact, so we're going to be able to move through him fairly quickly, but that's just kind of a general process that I take when I'm supporting. So to begin with, we're going to start with the feet here, and I use 3 different types of supports: a light, a medium, and a heavy. The heavy are the most sturdy connections to the model, but unfortunately they're going to leave the most amount of quote-unquote damage to the model. None of these supports are overly destructive, but they are going to leave small divots on the final model. So the heavy ones are for my very secure connections, the real structural stuff, and the ones that I want to hide on the least visible surfaces possible. My medium supports are going to be, let's see, I'll click on heavy here. I'm not going to be going over in detail my particular settings at the moment. This is more methodology and kind of a process on how I complete supports at the moment. My medium supports are going to be for features that are a little bit more delicate, but are also a little bit more front facing. So where I might start with a heavy support to get a good structural start, I might fill in around that heavy support with some mediums to lessen the damage, but also increase the amount of area that's supported. And the medium supports are what I use the most often. Light supports are going to be very fine features and very small portions of the model. These are not going to be structural at all and are really reserved for only the finest of features. I don't use them a whole lot. So to begin with, I'm going to start with our feet here, and I want to get some good kind of structural supports down. So throughout this whole model, we're going to be looking for these islands and these kind of larger open areas. We see right through here these kind of wider areas. These are each one of our individual layers, and sometimes the layers get pretty wide, and we wouldn't want to support this island, for example, just in the middle. Because if we can think about that pulling off our build plate, each one of these ends of this particular island might have a tendency to curl at the edges or might rip and stay stuck to the build plate. So we want to make sure, especially on these wider layer areas, we're kind of supporting everywhere. So the whole layer comes off that build plate. But for now, we're going to start with some heavy models. You'll see these presets changing as we go along. I am using some custom keybinds to switch back and forth between these. I've also got some keybinds set up to hide and show our supports. As we'll see here in a bit, this model is going to be covered in supports, and it's going to be fairly difficult to see the model to support it. So I do have a toggle to change these only into where that support contacts the model. So to begin with, we want to start with a real heavy base. So I'm going to take our heavy supports and get some of these islands. I know I can come back a little later and support each one of the sides of this with a medium, but right now I'm really just looking to get a real solid base going on this foot. So I'm going to support just some various areas here to get some real strong connections going, and then we'll come back through and do some of the details. So I've got my foot done. I'm going to switch to my mediums, make sure I get these areas where the kind of layer areas are real wide. I'm going to make sure we get each one of these toes. For kind of this bigger toe, I might go on the side a little bit as well. And then with my medium, I'll go in and fill any little gaps and just do some additional bracing. The reason we know that this foot isn't necessarily going to be seen because it's going to be attached to the base, but I don't necessarily want to fill it up completely with these heavy supports. While that would create a very strong base for the model and some real strong attachment points, we've got to think about removing these supports eventually. Our goal obviously is to print this model and to take it off its supports and use it. So we don't want to, just because this surface won't be seen, we don't want to overly damage it or create a situation where these supports get fused to this model in a way that removing them on some more delicate areas might snap the foot off completely. So we don't want to necessarily cover it in heavy supports, but we do want to make sure we've got some firm connections. That's where those mediums come. So there is my foot supported. We can see via kind of this white line We can move up the model and see each one of these layers or kind of where it connects to the rest of the model as well. So what I'm doing is I'm looking for the area where this connects back to the rest of the model. If this was free hanging, I might want to support the back or the sides of it a little bit more, just to make sure it connects with the model, the rest of the model securely. That's something we want to keep in mind about all features of this model as we move forward. The feet, and especially this crossbow and this arm, these are all sections, especially in relation to this crossbow and the rest of the model. The model is going to benefit as it prints, and as it prints more and more, it's going to benefit more and more from each support that we place moving up. The kind of load or the forces that get applied to the model as it's peeling off the build plate are going to be dispersed more and more over all of the supports that we add to this model. So the kind of core of this is going to remain pretty sturdy as long as we start well and kind of support each piece well as we move up. The model as a whole is going to benefit. And like we were mentioning before, we always want the model to build upon itself and not always need supports. So we can see that this leg joins up with the model right through here really quickly and becomes part of this core very quickly and becomes one piece. If we're thinking about this crossbow, for quite a while from where it begins down here, as it moves up, we kind of see this white line getting higher and higher, but it does not connect with the back with the rest of the model yet. Kind of moves through this arm and doesn't connect until all the way up here until this knee, which means this whole piece is free floating and only connected to the build plate via the supports, but it does need to connect back to the model eventually and in a very specific way. Any shifting of this whole feature when it comes back to the model is going to be very noticeable and is going to lead to a print that you're not going to want to keep, and invariably a failure and something we throw away. And we want to avoid that as much as possible. So it's key to remember that sometimes we have features that are disconnected from the main model that need to connect back up. And we want to treat everything the same and keep everything very sturdy. So once it comes together into a full model, it looks good. So for now, we'll continue up this leg. See, we've got some very small islands up here, which we'll take care of with some medium supports. Since this is only 1 or 2 layers deep, I'm fine with just one support. Kind of beginning those, and it's kind of doing dual duty, supporting this model a little bit more as it grows taller and taller. That's about it for that leg. Move on to this other foot and leg. We'll go back to our heavy supports. Some big ones throughout here. Create our real big and real solid connection points. And then we'll move back to our medium to get some more of our details in smaller areas. Placement of these is really just looking for these big areas, looking for these kind of valleys where 2 separate portions of the model come together. We can see the very first couple layers in white are printing, and then eventually they meet right here. Sometimes those meeting areas are a little fraught, or we want them to be successful as well. So placing a support there will just help that wide area as well. So there's the bottom of our foot. We can see that this doesn't connect back to the model until we get up to here. That's a relatively small amount, and we've got some really good connection pieces here, so I'm not too worried about supporting the back here. Go up through these wraps. We can see this kind of shaded feature here. This is our support, and where Lychee is going to automatically route the support. That's going to be something we're going to be taking a look at a little bit later. There are 2 main types of supports. We've got a regular support we see kind of ghosted in gray here. I select the point where I want the support to connect to the model to, and the slicer calculates the best and shortest route to get that support from the model to the build plate. In this instance, it's very simple. I'll turn that on here. I want to support that point, and it can route it immediately out and down to the build plate. What we see here and what it's trying to do is something called a miniature support. This is a support that is very thin and is generally reserved for areas that are over top the model itself, or an area that needs to be supported but can't be routed back to the build plate. These type of supports are ultimately very necessary on most models. It's something that I try to minimize the use of as much as possible, because we can think of this particular portion of the model. We need to support it, which is going to create a blemish at that support point. But in the case of a mini support, it's also resting on top of the model. So not only are we going to get a blemish at the support point, but also where this mini support connects back to the model. Also, in post-processing these models and kind of gluing them together and making them ready for paint, this is another thing that we're going to have to worry about removing from the model itself. And again, in my support work for other clients, I want to make sure that the end user has as easy of a time removing these supports as possible. So I try to avoid these when I can. You can see that Lychee wants to create one right there, but if we move even off to the side a little bit, it will create a support that goes down to the build plate, and we can very easily do some advanced editing of that support to drag it right where we want. And then this is a support that goes back down to the build plate. This does technically, in theory, use a little bit more resin, but this is a larger support that's going to be easier to remove while we're doing our post-processing, and not another step to do while we're cleaning and getting ready to paint them. So for now, we'll let that go. See in the video a little bit later the features that are going to require mini supports and some techniques to kind of minimize the blemishes and increase the ease of removing them. But for now, we're going to continue up and keep supporting these small islands. Up. Looking around the edges here, we see we've got some very tiny features. We could come in and do some light supports here, but we can consider each one of these layers is half a millimeter thick. So some of these tiniest islands, the head of the support is going to be bigger than the feature itself. So I'm not going to worry too much about these tiniest islands, because they're just features that just won't resolve in the final mode anyway. So I'm going to let those go. Like we saw before, this connects back up with the main portion of the body pretty quickly, so we don't need a whole lot of extra support on that leg. What I'm going to move to now is this kind of loincloth bit here. Again, we know this is the underside of the model and a side that's not going to be seen, so we're going to put some heavy supports down here, get a real firm connection to the build plates. Sometimes we have to play with that orientation a little bit to get a support to generate. In this case, we see this one has been flagged red. Lychee does this when a support intersects with the model itself. So we kind of want to edit this a little bit to make sure it doesn't connect. We can see that through here, it doesn't actually intersect with the model, but kind of it's a buffer zone that is set up between Lychee and the model itself. And that's a little too close for comfort for me. So I'll go ahead and edit this and draw it away a little bit and continue going. This loincloth bit here is a good miniature version of an example of something we see on a lot of minis. Because a lot of minis have capes or armor or pieces that drape down in front of them. We can see we don't have a whole lot of options for placing these heavy supports on the bottom side, which is the side that's not going to be visible to while it's being displayed. But what we can do with these is the back side of this particular piece is not going to be seen as well. Not only when we're looking at it from the front is it hidden, but also if we're looking at it from the back, the back of that loincloth is hidden as well. So I can go ahead and place some heavy supports back here to kind of further help the stability as it moves up, but also kind of help support it in general. So now we'll switch to my medium supports to build this out a little bit more. Place a heavy support here, and we can, since these are features of this, I kind of want to support these smaller islands, but even a light support is quite a bit for that. So what I'm going to do is I want to use the mini supports because they're smaller. I can capture some more of these details, but I don't necessarily have another place in the model for those mini supports to go. Something we can do is we can create a mini support, but connect it just straight back to a regular support. I will do that by, in the light sheet, shortcuts here. So I can click on that point, it creates a mini support, and I can just click on my support. That way that feature is supported, but it's still connected to this main support and should come off the model as we remove support. We'll do that here as well. Do some more to make sure we can. This particular piece is very short and small, so I'm confident that just this amount of support will support it as it moves up and eventually connects back with the rest of the model. I'm going to turn it off here. And now that I've done that, I will move to the underside here. And usually this area on a lot of models is not going to be seen, since a lot of these models are standing and are generally hidden by capes and armor and other features of the model. We're going to be able to get some good supports in here, and these are going to lend a lot of strength to the model overall as it continues to build up. I'll place some heavy supports in here, and I'm going to keep going a little bit further in. Just because I have the area, I know it's not going to be seen, and I can get a real strong core of support for in or my medium supports. Got a real strong core. So moving up through the torso, start to look at some of these smaller features. We can really see this stair stepping here, and this because of the way that we oriented the model to begin with, we aren't facing too far forward. So the stair stepping is a good example of each of these layers building upon themselves and building just a little bit further out than the layer before it. So none of this area is going to need to support it. We see some of our layers are a little bit wider here, but again, if we think of each one of these layers as 0.5 millimeter thick or about 0.5 micron thick, we see that this area is very thin. So we don't need to do any supporting through here. Some other things to consider is we can see kind of the end of an island right here on this belt. But what we also see is the very next layer connects back to the model. So while it's not supported on this front leading edge, it is supported the entirety of the back of it. This is an area that, while it's a wide open area, is still fairly supported by the rest of the model. So I don't need to support that additionally. So I'm going to let that go. Kind of keep moving on up through the face of the model. We can see as we move into the head, got a pretty open layer here and a good place to support. So I'm going to go ahead and throw one there. And we start to get into these leaves and the sides of his cap. So we'll go ahead and if we switch to our heavy, we notice that the tip of that heavy is almost bigger than the bottom of that cap anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and switch it to a medium. We also know that that's going to be a fairly small feature, so a medium is going to be pretty robust to support that. And yeah, we'll kind of continue on up. Ideally, we would go behind it, but since there's not a whole lot of room, Lychee is not sure where to route that support, so we don't have a whole lot of options. So we'll continue on the front, go on the inner edge of both of these. This is another good example of where we want to not only support where these layers start or where these islands where a particular feature begins printing, but we want to support that feature because it's going to meet back up with the rest of the model eventually. We want to make sure it stays locked in space as much as possible. So that also means supporting some features, especially thin ones, from side to side. So from front to back and side to side. So a couple of these inside of here are going to go a long way into making sure that these portions of his cap are going to stay in good place. Also, just to help us from front to back a little bit more, I'm going to place a couple more on the very front here, using my light supports because these are pretty small features and they are facing front, so I want to minimize the blemishes as much. Next, we're going to move into something I tend to do as I'm moving up these models. I'm going to display these supports, and we can see every point we've clicked has generated one of these supports. You can see it gets real dense down here at the bottom, and as we move up through the core here, we've got a whole lot of these supports that overlap each other. The columns are overlapping each other, even though they're going to similar areas. We saw, for some reason, this routing of the supports is not always the most optimal. This wanted to shoot this over the hand when we could very easily move it in here and keep everything clustered up a little bit more. But something I tend to do as I move up the model and things become more complicated is I try to combine supports as much as possible. This saves us some material, and it helps us keep the model clean as we move up and makes our job taking off supports later that much easier. What I can do, for example, is combine this particular support with this existing one and have it just be a little bit of a branch off this other guy. And I'm going to move through and do that now. And this is kind of a cleanup step that really helps the post-processing, helps us save a lot of material, a little bit of material, and just generally neatens everything up quite a bit. You can even kind of go back a little bit here and clean that up. And this is something I start doing once I get up off the build plate a little bit. We can think of removing this model from these supports. This foot is going to come off all of these supports straight up and is not going to have any issues and is not going to become entangled in the supports. So we don't need to worry about the base a whole lot. But as we move up, we might have supports that cross over this arm, for example, to support this leaf, or become a little bit more intertwined. And it helps a lot to think about that and keep the removing of the supports in mind as we move up. So as we go through this model, you'll see me take a second to stop and combine supports wherever I can. So we've got these kind of bits of his cap supported. Go ahead and turn those off again and focus on his chin. Luckily, this is going to be a downward facing side. I'm going to go ahead and place one of our heavier supports in the front, and then turn everything back on and use a couple of my mediums to move to a little bit more of the front facing side, but also just give us a little bit more support. We also see that our nose needs supported right here. This is a great place for a light support, as it's going to be front facing. It's going to be a feature that gets seen, but it's also only 1 or 2 layers thick, so it's going to be easily handled by a light support. We see this bridge is an area where the rest of the model and this one island connect back up. I want to support that, so we're going to use probably the smallest of all our supports, which would be a mini light support, and kind of just get that covered as well. The rest of the face here all builds upon each other, and we're going to be okay with the rest of that. Looking at the ears, usually ears on a lot of these 3D models are, especially on elf characters or other fantasy characters, tend to be free floating and kind of hovering above the model itself. These particular ears, we've got a very small island here, which will support, but this one back here begins and kind of intersects with the rest of the model and is going to print just fine by itself. This guy will go ahead and use a mini support. And just that one medium, I think, will cover us there. So we'll leave that. And now we've got the front face, we've got the legs, the feet, kind of the front of the torso supported. We've got the head done as well. We'll kind of look at his hat here and make sure that it's good to go. We've got some areas that could be supported, and this is a very good place to demonstrate where I tend to use mini supports and how I tend to use them. We see we've got some areas, and it kind of creates a little bit of an overhang here. We've got some areas that would benefit. We've got some really wide layers here that would benefit from some support. So what I do in these circumstances and when I use mini supports, I try to go and place my middlemost support, which is going to be in the middle of the hat here, to then kind of pick the best place for this support to connect. If this was a heavily textured surface, I would try to hide it in a divot and kind of hide these support connections wherever you can in features of the model as well. If this was heavily textured and had a lot of dimples or cracks or crevices, sometimes we can hide our support connections in features of the model itself. For this particular one, I'm just going to place it kind of in a flat spot where I can. And then I like to create fans of these mini supports. What this does is it's going to take this initial support and I'm essentially going to copy it, but it's going to, instead of going from the model to another point on the model, it's going to come up from my initial point, and I'm going to be able to place it wherever I want. So in this case, I'm going to place it on this other area where I need a support here. That's going to creates 2 points that are being supported on the model at the cost of only one blemish on the top surface here. So it's a good way of using mini supports when you need to. You invariably need to use them, but minimizing the damage to the model itself as much as possible. I'm going to go back here. I'm going to copy this one again and use it to support this. Now this area doesn't need too much support, so I'm going to stop there, but it creates a little bit of a fan. We've only got one blemish area on the top of the model, the top face of that model, and we've got all the support we need. This also makes a real convenient area to grab when we are post-processing this model and removing all these supports. This fan is really easy to grab onto with either pliers or tweezers and make support removal that much easier. So we'll move on from there to the back of the model. I'm satisfied with kind of the front and the supports there. Got a real strong base and a lot of strong supports on the bottom. Moving up. So now we'll kind of go to the complicated task of all these individual leaves. We always need to keep in mind what our layer settings are, because while this seems like a pretty daunting task and there are a whole bunch of these little individual islands, each layer again is only half a micron thick, or 0.05 millimeters. So this whole feature ends up being very small, and a lot of these leaves, like we've been paying attention to before, connect back up with the model very quickly. So none of these leaves are going to need very heavy support. It's just that there are a whole lot of points that we need to make sure we're covering. So I'll start at the bottom, and we need to make sure we cover this back area of the of this kind of cape as well. I'm going to go ahead and hide some of this stuff. This is a bottom-facing feature and pretty hidden, so I'm going to take this opportunity to place some more heavy supports just to continue to give us that good base. And I'll switch to my mediums and kind of round this out. This is also an area where I could consider combining some of these supports, but because this model is going to lift straight up off this base, I'm not too worried about combining things just yet. So we'll pop a couple here. So we can use our mini supports where we can. That portion good. Again, we've got heavy supports and it meets right back up with the model, so I'm not concerned. And now we'll start in on this cape here. We're going to be using a lot of medium supports, but we do also, wherever we notice an area, especially as we move up and we get taller, we want to, again, brace this thing as it gets taller and taller. So we do want to use heavy supports here and there to support it from front to back and side to side. So you'll see me switching back and forth between those for a little bit here, especially on some of these base areas. So for right now, we're going to fast forward a little bit as we go through this and support each one of these little islands, and we'll kind of see what it looks like on the other side. Okay, we've gone through this model. I've placed medium supports on the majority of these leaves here, for a lot of the bigger connection. Not seeing a whole lot of opportunities to place heavier supports. So in lieu of doing that, I'm going to use more of my medium supports where I could get away with just using a light support. For example, tucked in here, this is an area that's only 1 or 2 layers thick, but I want to capture that detail. Since I have the opportunity to place a medium support, I'm going to, just because I'm thinking of the stability of the rest of the model itself. I'm going to kind of keep going through here and doing that. Some of these very small areas, I'll go ahead and just use a light support. But in lieu of using heavy supports, I'll elect to use more medium support. Checking to make sure I heard everything. Here's one. A little bit here. Here we see all these lines coming off, placed a whole bunch of supports, and now is the time where I will turn everything back on, kind of go through here and see where a lot of this stuff is connecting up with each other, kind of go into our cleanup step here. So we'll start to find some of these supports. Don't want to get too drastic with this. We want to make sure we're being efficient and saving ourselves some material wherever possible, but I don't want a huge area to only be supported by one support connection. Let's say we had a whole bunch more coming off here. It's going to take a failure of just this support, make me miss each one of these individual islands and thus losing those features and leading to kind of a failed print. So I don't want to go too crazy, because you gotta also keep in mind another step that will kind of run at the end of this is bracing each one of these supports to ensure the supports print correctly as well, because your model is almost never touching the build plate. So you need your supports to be successful for your model to be successful. So what we're doing here is keeping all of this stuff in mind as we place these to ensure model is printed successfully and we get as much detail as possible. So we'll need to do remove. Not a whole lot of rhyme or reason for which ones I'm picking to adjoin to the others. I'm just trying to create gaps here and just generally open everything. This got not a whole lot of empirical evidence to base this on, but in my mind, if this area is a little bit more open, this is also going to help our resin flow back into a lot of these internal areas as we're printing and as it lifts off the build plate. At least in my mind, I feel like it can kind of reset and get into these areas a little bit better as well. It's kind of increasing our overall success. So that's kind of another reason see, we've cleaned this up quite a bit here. This one, and there we go. We've cleaned this up pretty well. I'm pretty happy with that. We see we've got a mini support here, which I will take off, place with the bigger one. So we are looking pretty good. We see we've got an island here that is not supported, but again, that's a very small portion of an island where if I did place a support right here, it's going to be nestled up in there, and I run the risk of this just becoming fused with the model entirely. So at the risk of kind of creating an error, I'm going to let that go, it's going to merge with the next layer, which is going to be peeled up by the rest of the model anyway. Not too concerned about. So there we go. We've got a whole bunch of connections to the model, and we're looking pretty good back there. So I've taken care of the back. Next, I'll move to the arms and the appendages, and it's a lot of the same stuff. Getting heavy or very firm connections to the beginnings of each one of these fingers, and making sure they stay locked in space as much as possible until they connect up with the hand, making sure the hand and the fingers stay locked in place as much as possible until it connects to the arm, and then the arm with the rest of the model. We're fairly lucky here with this arm, since he's kind of resting his hand on his knee there. We connect back up and get all of a sudden a very strong connection point with the rest of the model here. So we can kind of go a little bit lighter with the supports on this hand, and again, try to preserve as much detail there as well. So I'll start with my heavy supports. You can see this heavy support is a little much for this finger, so we'll probably end up keeping the heavy supports confined to just the hand and the palm of the hand, and then we'll end up using some medium supports to get these fingers, some of the pads of the hand here, and light supports for the very tips of the fingernails here. This is another key area to think about support removal as well. If I had loaded up all of these features with heavy supports, the heavy supports are necessarily harder to break away from the model, and I really run the risk of, when I go to remove supports, taking off a whole finger while I run the risk of taking off a whole finger while I take off those heavy supports. So it's very much a dance between using heavy enough supports to make sure that the features print correctly, then also using light enough supports that they come off, the supports come off easily and leave all of your features intact. So all I'm going to do here are these light supports for the very, very tips of the fingernails, and then I'll use some mediums on the backs of the fingers, again, getting support in on faces that we don't see, and I am pretty comfortable with that. Got some stuff in here. It's kind of cuff supported, which is going to be a little tricky. Just in there. Turn these back on. Line a little bit. This area I'm not too worried about, because again, we were able to support these and place these supports in such a way where the model will lift straight up and off, and we don't need to detangle anything, but we'll go ahead and do some cleaning. To this cuff out on it. Outside. This is a base that's going to be fairly visible. I want to make sure this has got some side-to-side support as well. I'm going to add one to the side there, and then very quickly it connects back up with the rest of them. I think I'm good to go. And continue up the arm here. Good area, I think, to place a heavy support, because it's going to be kind of not visible from the front, and just help us get a real good solid connection in. But on the sides here, I will hymns. Here, no. Then I might inside here. See, it's getting harder and harder to place supports that will connect back down to the build plate while also being fairly easy to remove. So I'll go one more up here and then kind of switch to the inside here, turn off everything, and we can see inside of this kind of armpit area. Got a couple islands, a couple of these leaves that can be supported. This is yet another type of support we'll create, and actually looks like it was able to route that right. We'll go ahead and leave that guy. This arm, want to try to support a little bit more on the inside. So we'll do that again. It's got a really good connection to the body here, so it's going to remain pretty solid as we move up. So I'm not as worried about going further up this. Do need to capture though all these other links here that we do. Opportunity to place some heavy supports where I can. Here. This is a pretty big area, but it fairly quickly builds and is not very thick, so I'm not going to worry about support. That arm is looking good. Move on, we'll do something we should be doing a lot more often during all of this, is saving our work as we go. Slicers are pretty complicated programs, and I've lost many an hour of work to a crashing program. So just like anything, save your work as often as possible. Next, we'll do this crossbow portion and take the same tact as we did with the rest of the model. Start with the lowest point and build up. We also see that the entire underside of this is going to be downward facing and facing away from the front of the model, so we can be pretty liberal with where we place supports and the types of supports we. So I'm going to start real strong with a heavy here, and I generally like to place heavy supports and follow up with them as ropes and places with a lot of texture that face the build plate are usually or sometimes fairly hard to support. We can see this area in particular here. Got a bunch of very tiny supports, or a bunch of tiny islands that technically, if we wanted every bit of detail out of this coiled rope around this crossbow, then we would need to support each and every one of these tiny islands. There is a little bit of a point of diminishing returns with how many supports we want to place and the amount of detail we can pull out of this. So this is a good example of an area where it's not going to be seen. It's not prominently featured. If I were to support every one of these islands, we very quickly get into a block of supports that might block the flow of resin, and then we won't get those individual details anyway. And also, it's just the juice just isn't worth the squeeze in this area. So we'll fairly heavily support the bottommost layer of those individual areas, and then a lot of that resolution and a lot of that detail will come into play as more of the model gets printed and as the layers themselves are able to make up more of those details. So I'm not going to worry too much about the finer details, but I do want the model to be successful, so I'm going to still fairly heavily support the area. Bolster these heavy supports a little bit here, and try I'm getting side to side, and I can achieve or a little bit more front to back support that by supporting back here. So we'll go up that. Place a couple heavier supports here. Bolster it. Mediums. Let's get a little side to side. Let's get rid of this. Well, a lot of these miniatures, let's see, have weapons generally. A lot of them are swords and arrows and spears, and generally have weapons that come to a sharp point. If this particular model had been pointed up, then these layers would build on each other, and you can get a very, very fine, sharp point. But in this particular case, just because of the way we had to orient this, we've kind of got this long, flat area here. Luckily, we're able to support this fairly well underneath. But we also, just for the sake of the look of the model, want a sharp edge. So we're going to use our light supports and get out as far as possible with the support and try to drag as much of that kind of sharpness out as we can. So we'll use that with this smallest light support. Also know that this point, or this is going to come to a point because the head of this support, this lightest support, is 0.2 millimeters wide. So while it looks big on our screen here, it's still fairly small. So we know that this tip is going to be successful all the way out to a point where it's 0.2 millimeters thick. So we know we're still going to get some sharpness here, even though it doesn't go all the way out to the tip here. So, a couple more light supports here to try to get that done. Back to the underside, or we'll move back to some medium supports. Area. Heavy supports. Underside. This is a good example of where we've got a bunch of these little islands, but they're on the underside, and we don't necessarily want to support them all. But something we've noticed with this white line is we see that our layers grow really quickly as we move up. So even though I mentioned we don't necessarily want to support each one of these little islands, we do know that this layer grows really quickly. So we do want to add a little bit more than normal to go through. But I'm going to keep to my same process. I'm going to place my heavies first and go in and maybe bolster a little bit more. I would side. That's signs, and I'll start working frame here. We see we've got some grain to this wood. These are good areas to kind of hide some of our support. And kind of where these features join each other is sometimes a good area to place our heavier supports, since they'll be a little bit more concealed or eyes drawn to these other features a little bit more. Any blemishes to this. So here, heavy supports. I'll go ahead and go all the way up this handle here. Come back through. Generally bolster. Not an exact science as to where or why. Placing these, just making sure we've got good coverage as we go up. Paying attention sometimes to these. If we look at this white line here, the kind of triangle created at the top, we know that that's where the model is going to be building out. Layers are going to be building on each other and extending quickly. We can make sure we're catching the edges there. And then filling in. All right, so there's kind of the base of our little crossbow here. Move to fingers. Again, very small details, so I'm going to start with some light supports. Where I can. Fingers. See, it gets pretty tight quickly. You don't want to only rely on those light supports, so it's on the outside of the finger. You can also see, and we want to pay attention to, modelers make different choices as to how they place features on a lot of these. I do a lot, Filament Farm does a lot of custom printing work, so I've seen a bunch of different instances. So a couple areas I try to pay attention to are features that hover above, whether a feature hovers above the rest of the model or connects to it. A good example of this is this finger. A little bit more sturdier design choice would have been to have it kind of mate with this handle a little bit more like these other ones do. That would create a little bit some more support for this finger as it goes back. But the designer didn't do that, and we don't want to edit their design and take the time to do that. So we just want to make sure we support it a little bit more than we normally would, just to make sure that feature gets printed completely. But on the flip side of that, a good example of a feature being connected with the rest of the model is this arrow shaft here. We see it intersects with the base a little bit more than it technically would in real life, obviously, but it's got a good solid connection up here, and because it's only got a little bit of a gap underneath here and it's supported the rest of the way, we don't need to worry about supporting any of that arrow shaft. So just little things to be aware of as we're supporting this model. Now we'll continue up the hand here. Now the hand connects with the handle of the crossbow, and the handle of the crossbow itself is really heavily supported. So I'm not too worried about this area. We'll kind of move to the inside and start to get the underside of the cuffs here. This is another kind of free-floating area, so when I can, try to get some heavy supports in here just to kind of give us a good base and lock us in space a little bit better. Creep up the sides a little bit to give us that back and forth support. Just to the inside. Well, and there's that arm supported. We're resting on the knee, so now we're connected with the rest of the model, and we've got a very, very robust connection here. So we'll just go in here with this arm, and I like to support some of this area a little bit more, again, just to ensure success. And also, this is the underside of the arm, and it is in a fairly innocuous area. I'm going to place a mini support, and I'm going to employ that fan technique that we used a little bit earlier, just to help us out a little bit in this kind of small. Great, that's that arm supported. Just in doing that, we've got some of our smaller leaf tips in here. So I'm going to some light supports to catch all this and try to connect back to the model wherever. Sure, I'm going as much detail as possible. Covered. Support a little bit weird, so we went step 2. All right, so we've got the side. Finally, we've got this sword here, which connects to the model down here. It's free floating everywhere else. I'm going to go ahead and build that connection up. Then we're going to have to add a few. Go. Island that hurts. And then the hilt of the sword here. It's free floating as well, so we'll grab it. Side. All right. So, I'm pretty confident with how this is going to print. We'll kind of go through and combine supports just like we did before as much as possible. Now that we're kind of done and we've kind of worked all the way up the model as much as possible, catch these stragglers that sometimes get created. A little bit of cleanup. And now we're going to, so wherever possible, we've combined some of these supports, and this whole time we've been thinking about taking off the supports and how easy that's going to be. What we want to do, and something I want to notice here, is we've got this support that isn't very necessarily supporting these leaves here, or the bits of this cloak here, but they are passing over the arm of this model. Where before, and with every other area, we've thought about this model coming off these supports straight up. If we did that in this area, we've kind of captured this hand a little bit by these, and it might be a little bit more awkward to take this model out. Something we can do is, just be aware of those areas. And in this case, it's as simple as moving this whole little tree to the inside here. And that kind of takes away the necessity to thread this arm through there and makes it a little easier to remove the supports. We got to make sure while we're doing that, that these angles or the length that this support has to kind of jut out from the vertical portion of the support isn't too long, but in this case, I am comfortable with that. And I kind of freeze this arm up a little bit more. We'll kind of make sure we don't have any other areas like that. And if we do, we want to make sure at the very least then that it's easy to remove, or we want to think about sections of the supports that are easy to remove. So going back to thinking about lifting this model straight up off these supports, we can see that along the back of this cloak, some of these supports kind of wrap in and over the model. That's going to prevent us from lifting this straight up and out. So when we go to brace all of these supports, which is the step we're going to take next, we want to make sure we're kind of creating sections that are easy to peel away. What I'm going to do is use one of the very few automatic features of Lychee that I use, and that's going to be this bracing feature. What that does, we click that, it's going to look at all these supports and generate these kind of crisscross braces wherever possible, just to, again, shore up the strength of the supports, because strong and successful supports are going to mean a successful print. And what we can see is it's kind of joined some of these in the back. We think about the need of breaking off these supports to enable lifting the rest of this model up off the base supports. We can see that we could fairly easily peel these away from the model and maybe snap them off the base or snap them off lower, enabling the rest of this model to be exposed. That's a step that I think it's overlooked quite often. The removal of these supports is something that I think more people should keep in mind, because inevitably they're going to have to come off, and the harder it is to do that after you've printed, just can lead to more failures of the model. If we're worried, for example, with freeing this arm, we might be rotating this model around and end up snagging one of these fingernails or a finger or the little bits of this guy's cap here and snapping those features off. And we really want to, again, minimize waste and minimize failed prints and kind of retain as much detail as possible. So thinking about all steps of creating a model from supporting to support removal to post-processing cleanup, I think is very important. And we've done that here. The only little areas that are a little bit of concern are these kind of very thin supports that come in and support the underside here. But we can see that they're fairly easily going to be able to be pulled out of this area. And also this cluster of supports is freestanding. So if we need to, when we're removing supports, we can remove just this little bit of section, break them off at the base, and kind of open that area up as well. You can also see that the face, we used lighter supports on these thinner areas, so we know they're going to break away. And when we go to pull this off, all of these supports have got to squeeze through this middle area here, but there's plenty of room and it shouldn't be an issue. With the crossbow and this whole area, we've gotten lucky that we don't need to cross over anywhere. So all of this will just lift straight up and off. We could kind of go the extra mile and combine some of these supports in here, but since this is going to lift straight up and off, I think we're good to go. Besides that, I think this model is ready to go. I'm going to change our raft here just as a personal preference. And I think we are good to go. So to recap what we've done with the model, so to recap what we've done and kind of our process for the model, supporting this model. So to recap what we've done, we have assessed the original model and how it loads into the program. We determined that we needed to rotate it back a little bit to preserve as many of the front-facing features as possible and minimize the amount of supports and therefore support blemishes that there are on the front of the model. We then moved to creating some very strong support connections on the bottom of the model, working from the bottom of the foot all the way up one leg, moving on to the next foot and the next leg, moving through the torso, any front-facing features up through the chest and torso of the model into the face, supporting the face and any features on the front. We then moved to the back, supported all of these individual little bits and pieces here. Then finally, we moved to the extremities, the arms, and supported again from the bottom up. The entire time, keeping in mind the entire process from supporting to printing and finally removing the supports. Once we supported the entirety of the model, we went back through and we cleaned up and combined any supports that needed to be combined, and we ensured that did not have any supports crossing back over the model, and the model was going to be easy to remove from the supports we've created. This is the first parts of a series of these instructional videos that I want to create. Again, for those watching on Twitch or YouTube, this is the full live stream of this particular video. This video is then going to be cut up into smaller pieces, both for YouTube and for Instagram and TikTok. We'd love to hear any feedback that you've got. Please leave comments on these videos. We look at everything that we get. Please check us out at filamentfarm.net. You'll see a lot of these models for sale printed, and where you'll see our listings for custom work. We love to do this stuff, and we want to just grow this industry as much as possible and provide as much information as possible. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for checking out the stream.